There's a particular kind of afternoon that belonged entirely to the 1970s. The smell of hot asphalt, the sound of a station wagon door slamming shut, a kid sitting in the very back seat, facing backward, watching the world disappear behind the car instead of rushing up to meet it. Nobody thought twice about any of it. That's just what an ordinary afternoon looked like back then. This was the decade when freedom and recklessness lived right next to each other. Sometimes in the very same room, sometimes in the very same toy box. Today, we're taking a walk through some of the things that defined growing up in the 1970s. Things that felt completely normal at the time and would get somebody arrested, sued, or fired if they tried them today. Some of these are going to make you laugh out loud. A few might genuinely surprise you. And we're saving one for the very end that almost nobody remembers quite the way you'd expect. So stay with us for that one. Let's start with something every kid on the block wanted more than almost anything else. Clackers were two hard acrylic balls hanging from a string with a small ring in the middle. You held the ring and swung your wrist until those two balls smacked together, above your hand and then below it, faster and faster, clack, 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 like a tiny machine you controlled with nothing but rhythm. Every kid on the playground wanted to be the one who could keep it going the longest and the loudest. Here's the part almost nobody talks about anymore. The harder you clacked them, the hotter the acrylic got, and acrylic under enough heat and pressure turns brittle fast. The balls would shatter, not crack, shatter, sending sharp plastic fragments flying in every direction, sometimes straight back at the face of the kid holding them. Bruises were common. Deep cuts happened. There were real cases of plastic fragments landing in children's eyes. Parents panicked. Schools banned the toy outright, and eventually the government pulled Clackers off store shelves for good. The toy that was supposed to be pure fun turned out to be, quite literally, a small handheld explosion waiting to go off. If you grew up anywhere rural, or even just in the suburbs, in the 1970s, you remember the truck bed. No seat belts, no rules, just the bare metal floor, the open road rushing past, and a pile of cousins or neighborhood kids sitting on old tires or a toolbox, holding on for dear life and loving every second of it. You could lie back and watch the clouds go by. You could lean over the side and feel the wind pull at your hair. It felt like absolute freedom, because in a sense, it was. That freedom came at a real cost, though. A sharp turn or a sudden stop, and a kid back there had nothing holding them in place at all. Accidents happened more often than anyone likes to admit, and by the 1990s, most states had quietly written laws making it illegal for children to ride back there. Today, an officer would pull that truck over before it made it to the end of the block. And if the truck bed was the country kid's favorite seat, the rear-facing back row of a station wagon was the suburban version of the same idea. You sat facing the cars behind you instead of the road ahead, with nothing but a metal handle to grab onto if the driver took a turn too fast, watching headlights chase you down the highway like something out of a spy movie. Parents genuinely liked the arrangement. The kids stayed occupied, stayed quiet, and stopped asking when we'd get there. Nobody gave much thought to what would happen in a sudden stop. Eventually, crash data caught up with the design, and rear-facing seats simply disappeared from new cars, replaced by the booster seats and airbags we take for granted now. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. In the 1970s, you could light a cigarette in your airplane seat, 30,000 feet in the air, with a baby 2 rows up and nowhere at all for the smoke to go. Every armrest had its own little built-in ashtray. The so-called smoking section was a polite fiction, because smoke has never once respected a section line. On some flights, attendants actually handed out free cigarettes and called it part of the service. It took until the mid-1980s for airlines to start seriously separating smoking from non-smoking areas, and even longer for domestic flights to ban smoking outright, with international routes following after that. Today, someone lighting a cigarette in seat 14C would have the whole cabin in an uproar within seconds. Back then, it was simply Tuesday. And the airplane wasn't even the easiest place to find a pack of cigarettes. Walk into nearly any grocery store, gas station, or workplace break room in the 1970s, and there was a good chance a vending machine stood right there. Drop in some coins, and out came a pack of cigarettes. No ID required. No questions asked. A kid could buy a pack of Marlboros standing right next to the Snickers bar, and nobody blinked twice. It was simply how things worked, right up until lawmakers finally caught up with what that kind of convenience was costing a whole generation of teenagers. If cigarettes were everywhere, so was the casual belief that a pill could fix almost any problem, especially the problem of wanting to lose weight fast. Magazines in the 1970s were packed with advertisements for diet pills aimed at housewives, working women, even teenage girls, all promising the same thing: less appetite, more energy, rapid results. What those advertisements left out, conveniently, was the main ingredient: amphetamines, legal speed, handed out with a prescription pad and a friendly smile. You'd take the pill in the morning and genuinely stop feeling hungry. You felt unstoppable, a little jittery maybe, but that jitteriness was simply understood to be the medicine doing its job. Doctors prescribed them without much hesitation. The side effects were real and serious: anxiety, mood swings, sleepless nights, a real risk of addiction. But for most of a decade, the cultural pressure to be thin was simply louder than any of the warnings. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 80s that amphetamines were reclassified and diet pills were pulled back and reformulated into something far less dangerous. Here's one that's almost hard to believe in hindsight, and it has nothing to do with anyone's choices at all. It's about what was quietly hiding in the walls and the toys around them, with no choice involved whatsoever. Lead-based paint was everywhere in the 1970s because it was bright, cheap, and easy to work with. It made red look redder and blue look like the summer sky. Swing sets were painted with it. Wooden toy trains were painted with it. Lunchboxes were painted with it. And small children chew on things, because that's simply what small children do. The lead didn't stay on the surface. It flaked off, it chipped, and it found its way into developing bodies and developing brains in ways nobody fully grasped until the damage was already done. It wasn't until 1978 that the federal government finally banned lead-based paint in homes and children's products. By then, an entire generation had already been exposed to it. In the classroom, a different kind of danger hung on the wall in plain sight, right behind the teacher's desk. A wooden paddle, sometimes with holes drilled through it to cut down on air resistance, was standard equipment in countless American schools. Misbehave, and you'd be told to bend over and take your punishment, sometimes right there in front of the whole class. Parents largely supported it. The saying at the time was simple, and most people believed it without question: spare the rod, spoil the child. It took child psychologists and medical researchers years to make the case that hitting a child with a wooden board didn't really teach anything beyond fear. Kids who'd been paddled often developed real anxiety about going to school at all. By the late 1980s, most states had banned corporal punishment in public schools entirely, trading the paddle for the slower, harder work of actually teaching kids how to do better. Saturday morning, for a kid in the 1970s, was sacred. You turned on the television, and there they were, bright cartoon mascots with enormous eyes, practically begging you to eat a bowl of something that was closer to dessert than breakfast. Tony the Tiger said it was great. Toucan Sam followed his nose straight to a box that held, depending on the brand, somewhere between 30 and 40 grams of sugar per serving. It worked because it was built to work. 5-year-olds glued to Saturday morning cartoons made for an extraordinarily easy audience, and nutritionists eventually sounded the alarm loud enough that lawmakers and health organizations started paying attention. Today, there are real restrictions on how products like that can be advertised during children's programming, and the same mascots that once sold pure sugar now talk about whole grains and added vitamins instead. The tiger's still around. He's just a lot quieter about it now. And the strangest advertising trick of the whole decade might have involved actual doctors. Television in the 1970s was full of cigarette commercials featuring men in white coats, real, licensed physicians, explaining which brand was gentler on your throat. These weren't actors playing doctors. These were the same people writing prescriptions and giving flu shots, now telling you which cigarette to smoke. If your own doctor smoked a particular brand, how bad could it really be? That trust collapsed only once the lung cancer numbers became impossible to argue with, and by the late 1970s, cigarette advertising disappeared from television entirely, replaced by Surgeon General warnings printed in small type on every pack. Up in the sky, a very particular kind of unfairness was simply built into the job. Flight attendants in the 1970s, called stewardesses, never anything else, were hired primarily for their looks. There were height requirements, there were weight checks, there were strict rules about makeup and hair, and uniforms that often meant miniskirts and go-go boots, regardless of the weather or the work itself. Many airlines required these women to be single, and some could be fired outright for getting married or becoming pregnant. An entire career depended on staying young-looking and constantly available by official company policy in writing. It took lawsuits, and it took the feminist movement of the late 1970s pushing hard against exactly this kind of rule before things genuinely started to change. Uniforms shifted, job requirements shifted. The word stewardess itself eventually gave way to flight attendant, and the sky stopped being treated, officially, as a fashion runway. And here's the one we promised to save for the end, because it isn't really about danger or lawsuits at all. It's about something a little more tender than everything else on this list. A mixtape, made properly, took real time. You sat by the radio with a blank cassette loaded, finger hovering over the record button, waiting for exactly the right song to come on, trying to catch it before the DJ started talking over the opening notes. You'd rewind, listen back, decide the order mattered just as much as the songs themselves, because it did. A mixtape made for a crush said things you could never quite say out loud. A mixtape made for a best friend said something different, just as real. You'd write out the track list on the cassette label in your very best handwriting, maybe decorate the case a little, and hand the whole thing over like you were handing over something fragile. Because in a way, you were. There was no algorithm building that playlist for you. No streaming service quietly suggesting what came next. Just one person, choosing every single song on purpose, for one other specific person, hoping the music said what they couldn't quite manage to say themselves. People listened to those tapes until they wore thin. Literally, the magnetic tape itself wearing down from being played so many times. Nothing today quite replaces what that felt like. The 1970s gave us all of this in the very same decade, real danger sitting right next to real tenderness, often without much space between them. Some of it needed to go, and went none too soon, and some of it, if we're honest, we still kind of miss. Memory Lane America, one story at a time.